So I'm going to draw briefly on the work of Ulrich Beck because I think that his work very much complements some of the concepts that Stengers is proposing for us. Beck is a social scientist and philosopher of the 90s and early 2000s, and I think he presents an important position in thinking about early childhood education and the challenges of a modernist desire for scientific rationality and social control in the 21st century. So he argues that product industries and large-scale human technologies of the current day produce environmental results such as climate change, which move beyond science's ability to determine certain cause, which is a key function of modernity. This idea that effects can be controlled and regulated within contained spaces, and that cause and effect can be managed and governed. So today, science is no longer an event conducted within contained spaces. Beck argues that current society and the world at large has ultimately become this sort of giant lab for experimentation. So Beck argues that this is an example of the human inability to manage the worlds of the 21st century, and I might argue of ever, as science has become so powerful that it no longer can control its own progress. So it's at this point where modernization exceeds modern theory. It becomes a paradox. And this is where Stengers argues that thought must be radically reconceptualized, returning to the relational and local milieu of situated, contextual thought and thinking. So Stengers argues that science got us here to this point, but science can't get us out of this place. The grand narratives of progress, of proven facts, measurable outcomes are no longer convincing. Yet, though these problems posed by the coming barbarism seem so large, they leave us in many ways sort of impotent to act, as she says, and they pacify us in the face of their intensity. So these problems, she argues, can no longer be left to experts despite the panic. Stenger says that this panic is sort of a mother of irrationality that inhibits us from thinking. So in this week's chapter, Stengers draws attention to the violences of linear economic growth, and she calls on us to consider what kind of cooperations and what kinds of thinking might be required if we were to collectively escape from the evidences of economic growth and competition. So here in these two chapters, her language is very clear. She, like Beck, is troubling epistemologies that are based in evidence and knowability, and she proposes that we need to begin creating a sense of what's happening to us. So pay very close attention to the language that she uses throughout this book, and this is a good example of that, because there's a very important change in the language that reflects a change also in orientation. So think about what happens to knowledge when it's conceived not with evidence, but rather with a sense. What kinds of orientations to meaning making are made when we're thinking about knowledge as a sense versus evidence. So in this first chapter, I think there's a significant orientation for us to hold on to in this course, which is what kind of sense might we create in response to current times? What might this sense make exist? And what else might be possible beyond evidence and beyond the measurable in current times? So Stengers writes that this book aims to contribute to a second history, a contribution to formulating questions and ways of thinking that might make something else possible, something radically different from what's already known in the world, and a future that perhaps is more heterogeneous, that is immeasurable, and that perhaps might make the world a more livable place for multiple beings. So in response to Stenger's writing this week, your portfolio assignment on Wix will be composed of two parts, and there will be directions of this on the Moodle page as well. So in your first digital portfolio entry, there's part 1, where you'll be situating your thinking within the text, and you'll be writing a 200 to 300 word response